The first time the woman who signed his paychecks called him her partner. Marcus Webb had a forkful of grilled salmon halfway to his mouth, and her grandfather was watching him from the far end of the table the way old men watch things they have already decided to remove. Marcus was a single black man, a private chauffeur working out of Portland, Oregon. He understood the world that Catherine Ashton moved through, understood its rules, its architecture, the specific weight of a room like this one. He had never, in 11 months of driving her, expected a single sentence to reach through the glass partition and drag him into the center of it. What would happen to you if the woman who paid your salary told an entire room full of strangers that you were the man she loved? Marcus Webb had a habit with the rearview mirror. He used it for the road. That was the rule, and it was a rule that had become, across 11 months of close quarters and late nights, and the particular silence that forms between two people when neither of them wants to say the wrong thing. Less about professionalism and more about something he couldn't have named accurately if someone had asked him to. Because Catherine Ashton was the kind of person you noticed whether you intended to or not. Not in the way her name appeared in business sections, which was as a sharp and deliberate and largely unsentimental executive. In quieter ways. The way she pressed her thumbnail against her lower lip when she was thinking through something no one else in the room knew was a problem yet. The way she looked out at the Portland skyline during the long drives, not at it, but through it, like she was looking for something she kept misplacing. He had taken the job because it paid well, and asked very little. After Meridian Structural went under, not because of anything Marcus had done wrong, but because a series of decisions, 3 levels above him, had traded long-term contracts for short-term reporting numbers, and the whole thing had come apart inside of 8 months, he had needed something that didn't require him to invest anything he couldn't afford to lose. Driving gave him that. 8 hours behind a wheel, a city scrolling past, enough silence to think without anyone needing anything from the thinking. He hadn't expected the silence to become something he shared. It started small. Late nights when Catherine would finish a board meeting past 10 p.m. and get into the back seat without a word, and Marcus would reach over and turn the radio down, not off, just low enough that the city could come through the glass instead. She never asked him to. He never explained why he did it. That was just the shape of the thing they had built. Then came the conversations that weren't really conversations. More like thoughts that had been held too long and needed air. Catherine saying something about a decision due by morning. Marcus offering something short and specific in return, the kind of response that didn't try to fix anything, just held the problem steady long enough for her to see it clearly. Neither of them making it into more than it was. He knew she drank black coffee, no sugar, in the hour before major presentations and chamomile tea after, when the adrenaline needed somewhere to go. He'd filed that away with the same precision he used to file load calculations and stress tolerances back when that was his work. He knew she shivered getting into the car on January mornings, so he had started turning the seat heater on 4 minutes before her scheduled departure. Not because the contract required it. Because he noticed, and noticing felt like the least he could do. There was a Tuesday evening in late September, when she had been quiet longer than usual, and the rain was doing something complicated to the lights along Burnside, and without turning from the window, she said, "Do you ever feel like you made all the right moves and still ended up somewhere you didn't choose?" Marcus kept his eyes on the road. He turned the question over the way he used to turn structural problems over, looking for where the load was actually resting. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes the thing that breaks isn't the thing you built wrong. It's the thing you assumed would hold." Catherine didn't answer. But her shoulders came down by maybe half an inch. The way shoulders come down when a person has been carrying something, and someone finally acknowledged that it was heavy. He didn't understand then what she was really asking. He would understand it later. The evening it changed was a Wednesday, cold enough that the first frost had killed the flowers along the parking structure's entry. Marcus was waiting outside the Ashton Capitol building when Catherine came through the glass doors, 37 minutes late, moving with the particular stillness of someone who had just spent 3 hours in a room where the decision had already been made and the meeting had been staged to look like a discussion. He got out to open the rear door. She walked past it. She opened the front passenger door and sat down. Marcus stood in the cold for a moment, then got back behind the wheel. He turned the radio off entirely and waited. Catherine looked straight ahead through the rain on the windshield. "I need to ask you something that's not in the job description." He said, "All right." She turned slightly toward him, not fully keeping one angle of escape. "There's a family dinner Saturday. At my parents' house in Lake Oswego. Nathan Prescott is going to be there." She said the name the way people say the name of a recurring headache. "My family has decided he's the solution to several problems at the same time." They've been making that extremely clear. Marcus knew who Nathan Prescott was. Not from the financial pages, though the name appeared there often enough. From 11 months of overheard calls and the particular flatness in Catherine's voice on the nights she'd come from events where he'd been present. From the specific brand of silence that filled the car afterward. "I need someone to come with me," Catherine said, "as my partner. Someone I can trust not to make this into something it isn't. Not to use it for anything." "Why me?" he asked. She answered without pausing. "Because you're the only person in my life I'm certain will be honest with me about what's actually happening in that room." It was a specific answer. Too specific for a simple favor. Not a compliment about his character. A statement about necessity. About something that had been building longer than a single Wednesday evening. He looked at the rain. He thought about the line he had spent 11 months being careful about. The one that kept this a job. Crossing it meant walking into a world built specifically to make him feel that he had wandered into the wrong story. Rooms where presence alone would be read as a provocation, and where the most powerful move available to the people in them would be to make him understand that without ever saying a word. He looked at Catherine. She was holding herself with the specific stillness of someone who has decided that composure is the only thing standing between them and the floor. "Okay," he said. "I'll be there." Saturday evening they sat parked outside the Ashton estate for nearly 3 minutes without moving. The house was the kind of large that old money is large, understated from the road, and impossible once you were inside it. Light came from every window. Catherine reached over and straightened his tie. Her fingers moved efficiently at first, then they stopped. Not because she'd finished, but because something shifted in the inch of space between them and her hands, stayed at his collar for a moment that was 2 seconds longer than the task required. She pulled back and looked at the house. "They're going to look at you," she said. "The moment you walk in, I know. Nathan is going to try to make you feel like you got turned around somewhere and ended up in the wrong place." Marcus looked at the house. "I've been in rooms where people were working very hard to make me feel exactly that," he said. "I'm still here." Catherine turned and looked at him directly then. Something moved across her face that wasn't pity, and wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite either of those things. Something closer to recognition. She opened the car door. As she stepped out, the small silk scarf she'd tied around the strap of her bag slipped loose. She picked it up and tucked it carefully into her coat pocket instead of retying it, the way a person holds onto something they're not ready to let go of in a moment that already has enough moving parts. Marcus noticed. He didn't say anything. He followed her inside. There is something worth sitting with in the architecture of those 11 months. A pane of glass between the front and the back of a car, a division that both of them understood without ever discussing it. Catherine in the back because that was the position of authority. Marcus in the front because that was the position of service. The glass existed to maintain a distinction that the world around them needed maintained. And yet in that divided space, two people had come to know each other in ways that most people who occupied the same buildings, attended the same meetings, called each other colleagues or friends, never quite managed. Catherine had no one in her life who had nothing to gain from her. Marcus had no one who asked nothing from his silence. They found each other not by ignoring the line between them, but by refusing to let it determine everything they were allowed to see. When Catherine got out of the back seat and into the front on that Wednesday evening, she wasn't just changing where she sat. She was saying something that neither of them yet had words for. The Ashton estate ran on the logic of rooms, designed to remind you exactly where you stood. The foyer was large enough to contain Marcus's entire apartment twice over, and the chandelier above it existed not to provide light so much as to establish a fact about the family that lived under it. Staff moved quietly at the edges of the space. Guests gathered in the sitting room beyond, their voices low and layered in the way of people who had learned that the most important conversations in rooms like this one were designed to sound like nothing at all. Catherine walked in the way she had been walking into rooms like this one since she was old enough to understand what they required of her. Marcus walked in beside her, not touching, and felt the room adjust around him the way a room adjusts when something unexpected enters it. He had expected it. Preparing for a thing is not the same as being comfortable with it. What he had not prepared for was Nathan Prescott. Nathan was standing near the fireplace holding a glass of Bordeaux, and the posture of a man who had not once in his adult life walked into a room and calculated whether he belonged. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of handsome that comes from generations of resources applied consistently over time. When he saw Catherine, something moved behind his eyes that was not surprise and not hostility. Something more calculated than either. He set his glass down and crossed the room. Catherine. He said her name with the ease of someone who has said it in 1,000 different contexts and knows the precise register for each one. Then his gaze moved to Marcus, not aggressive, measuring. I don't think we've been introduced. Marcus extended his hand first. Marcus Webb. Nathan shook it. The grip was deliberate and told Marcus exactly what it was meant to tell him. Nathan Prescott. He held the handshake one beat longer than necessary. How do you know Catherine? Catherine stepped close to Marcus's side before he could answer. Not theatrical closeness, the committed kind. She took his hand in both of hers and turned to face her parents, who had appeared from somewhere across the room with the precise timing of people accustomed to entrances that required their immediate attention. Mom, Dad. Her voice was the voice she used in shareholder meetings when the vote was already over. This is Marcus, my partner. The word landed in the Ashton sitting room the way a stone lands in still water. Eleanor Ashton, Catherine's mother, a woman whose elegance was the architectural kind, decades in the building and expensive to maintain, went very still. Her husband Richard looked at Marcus with the expression of a man conducting a rapid private assessment. The guests within earshot developed sudden intense interest in their drinks. Nathan's expression did not change. That was the detail Marcus held onto. Not the parents' reaction, not the temperature in the room dropping by a discernible degree. The fact that Nathan Prescott absorbed the information without any visible disturbance whatsoever and picked up his wine glass and took a small, unhurried sip. Marcus tightened his hand slightly around Catherine's. He turned to Richard Ashton with the measured steadiness of a man who had spent years in rooms where people were deciding what he was worth and had learned that the most important thing in those rooms was to be more certain of his value than they were of their doubt. It's a pleasure to meet you both, he said. The dinner was the kind of performance that families like the Ashtons staged when they wanted to give the impression that nothing was being performed. The table was set for 14. Crystal caught the candlelight. Conversation ran along the channels carved by years of repetition, markets, travel, philanthropic boards, the kind of charitable work that came with naming rights attached. Marcus sat beside Catherine and let the evening move around him, speaking when spoken to, listening carefully to everything else. Catherine played her part with the fluency of someone Sethlin who had been doing it her whole life. Her hand finding his on the tablecloth at intervals, her body language including him, without overstating it. When Richard Ashton asked how they had met, Catherine said, "He drives for the company." We started talking, honest, bare, making nothing of it. Richard's expression moved through several things quickly. Marcus looked across at him and said, "She knocked on the partition glass one night because she wanted to know if I had a raid on the infrastructure bond situation. I had one." It went from there. Catherine glanced sideways at him. That part was true. She had knocked, and he had had an opinion, and they had talked for 22 minutes in a parking garage while she waited for a call that kept not coming. She had not expected him to reach for that specific memory. Something in her expression shifted in a way she probably hadn't meant for anyone in the room to see. Across the table, Eleanor Ashton saw it. The older woman's eyes moved from her daughter's face to Marcus's face, and something revised itself quietly in her expression. Not warmth. Not yet. The particular stillness of a person who has just observed something they did not expect and is privately reassessing an assumption they hadn't known they were making. Nathan waited until the main course was cleared to make his move. He had been patient in the way that expensive, disciplined patience looks, participating in other conversations, asking questions that showed he'd listened to the answers, never appearing to be waiting. But Marcus had been watching him the way he used to watch systems under load, with the quiet, consistent attention of someone who had spent years learning to identify the exact point where a structure reveals its actual design. Nathan was waiting, and he chose his moment precisely. "Marcus," he said in the tone of genuine intellectual curiosity, "I'd be interested in your take on what's happening with the secondary market on Pacific Rim structured products right now. Given Catherine's position in the fund, I imagine that's something you two discuss." The ambient noise of the table thinned. Nearby conversations lost a thread. Marcus looked at Nathan directly. "We don't talk much about that, actually." "No?" Nathan offered a pleasant smile. "What do you talk about?" "The things that don't make it into the presentations," Marcus said. His voice was unhurried. Level. What a decision actually cost her after the room cleared out. Whether something was worth the fight. The difference between what she chose and what she was pushed into choosing. Nathan tilted his head slightly. A chauffeur with a nuanced understanding of the emotional cost of high-stakes fund management. That's genuinely unusual. A pause precisely timed, almost like something out of a story. The table had gone quiet. Marcus set his silverware down, carefully, without drama. He looked at Richard Ashton. "I'm her driver," he said. "That's not something I'd try to dress up or away. But here's what I can tell you about your daughter." He let that land before he continued. "I've seen her after the meetings where she had to fight for decisions she'd already validated 3 months earlier. I've watched her work through a problem at 11 at night that she wasn't going to get credit for solving. I don't respect the fund. I don't respect the name on the building. I respect the person who has to carry both of those things and still figure out who she is underneath them." The room was very quiet. Catherine was looking at him. Not with the composure she had worn since they walked through the door. With something rawer than that. The expression of someone who has just heard themselves described accurately by someone they did not know was watching closely enough to do it. Nathan looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then he reached for his wine. It was later, when the dinner had dispersed into smaller conversations and Catherine had been pulled toward the sitting room windows by her mother, that Nathan appeared beside Marcus in the rear hallway without announcing himself. "She doesn't need rescuing," Nathan said, his voice stripped of its dinner table polish. "I want to be clear about that before we talk." Marcus said nothing. "What she needs," Nathan continued, "is someone who can stand next to her when the actual weight comes down. Not one evening. Not one room full of her parents and their friends." He looked at Marcus with something that was not hostility. It was something closer to the honesty that only arrives when a person has run out of more comfortable options. When this becomes public, and it will, the weight is going to be significant. I'm asking you genuinely whether you're prepared for that. Marcus met his eyes. Are you asking because you care about the answer, or because you're hoping the answer is no? Nathan's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile. Maybe both, he said. He looked down the hallway. When he spoke again, his voice had the flatness of someone delivering a conclusion they've been sitting with for a while. I've known Catherine for a long time. Long enough to recognize that what I watched at that table was real. Which means I'm out of moves that don't cost her something. He looked back at Marcus. So I'm going to play the last card I agreed to play. Not because I think it changes anything. Because I said I would, and I keep my word. He walked back toward the sitting room. Marcus stood in the hallway turning the statement over. Understanding it for what it was. A warning from a man who had already conceded the outcome. The envelope appeared near the end of the evening, when the guests had thinned, and the night was reaching the point where staying longer would require explanation. Nathan placed it on the side table beside Catherine, with the calm of someone fulfilling an obligation. Clean edges. Official weight. The kind of envelope that comes from lawyers. Catherine looked at it. Something in her face went absolutely still. Marcus had seen that stillness before. in the car on nights when something was happening just below the surface of her words. He understood, half a second before he understood it, that this was what everything else had been circling. The Portland arrangement. Catherine had signed an agreement with her family 4 months earlier. Ashton Capital would consolidate its Pacific Northwest operations, shoring up a deteriorating position in 3 of the fund's major holdings. In exchange, Catherine would formalize her relationship with Nathan Prescott within the year, a union that would merge 2 of the largest private capital pools in the region in a way that the families involved called strategic, and that any honest person looking at the paperwork would have called something considerably older and less comfortable than that. She hadn't told Marcus because she was afraid he would look at her the way the people in this room looked at everything, as a position to be managed, as someone using him as a final gesture of autonomy before surrendering to what had already been settled. Eleanor spoke first, her voice low and controlled. "Catherine, this isn't the moment for this." "No," Catherine said. She picked up the envelope, she held it for a moment, then she tore it in half, cleanly with both hands, and set the 2 pieces back on the table. The room reacted the way rooms react to irreversible things. A collective stillness, then movement, then the particular charged silence that follows both. Richard Ashton's voice came low and very serious. Nathan stood without expression, watching Catherine with something that might have been respect if the evening had unfolded differently. He had known, Marcus understood now, how this was going to end. He had placed the envelope not to win. He had placed it to close a chapter he had agreed to close. It was the last move of a man who kept his word even when the word had stopped serving him. Eleanor reached for Catherine's arm. Catherine stepped back. "I'm not signing a revised version," she said, to her father, to her mother, to the room. "I'm not restructuring my life around a deal I didn't negotiate for myself. And I'm not going to keep pretending that what I want doesn't exist because it's inconvenient for what's already been decided." It was the bravest thing Marcus had watched anyone do in a very long time. It was also, he understood immediately, the thing that was going to cost her. They drove in silence for a long time after leaving the estate. Catherine had gotten into the back seat. Somewhere in the chaos of leaving, the closeness of the evening had reinstated the old distance between them. The partition was in its position. Marcus drove and said nothing, because nothing he could say yet would be the right thing. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice was flat with the particular exhaustion that comes after you have done something you cannot undo. "The arrangement. I should have told you." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't tell you," she said, "because I didn't want you to think I brought you there as a move in something I was already planning to lose. I didn't want you to look at me the way those people back there look at everything. Like a set of calculations. Why does it matter how I see you?" he asked. Not unkindly, he genuinely wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the one person I know who ever looked at me without wanting something from the looking," she finally said. "And I think I've been protecting that for longer than I realized, and tonight I probably destroyed it." The rain had started again. A patient kind of rain, the kind Portland does in October. Marcus watched the wipers move. He drove. The city moved past them. Nothing was resolved, and he had to figure out before Monday what came next. Here is the thing about secrets. They don't survive the moment you say them out loud. Not because the truth is too large. Because the act of saying it closes the distance between people in ways that can't be reopened. Catherine had kept the Portland arrangement hidden not out of calculation. Out of fear. The fear that if Marcus saw the full picture, he would understand himself as a piece in someone else's game and leave. What she hadn't understood yet was that the people who stay are rarely the ones who stay because everything looks simple. They're the ones who hear the complicated version and choose to keep showing up. Marcus pulled off the freeway without planning to. There was a gas station on the outer edge of the city where the suburbs had not yet committed to being suburbs, a stretch of asphalt and fluorescent light with dark open land on 3 sides. He turned in and cut the engine and sat with his hands on the wheel. The rain ticked against the roof. He got out. Not to open her door. Not from 11 months of professional habit. He got out because he needed to stand somewhere that wasn't moving. The rear door opened. Catherine stepped out. She hadn't been invited. She came anyway. They stood a few feet apart near the back of the car in the gas station's overexposed light. Neither of them spoke right away. Marcus said, "I lost something before this job, not just the income." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the dark line of trees at the edge of the lot. The project I'd spent 4 years on. The sense that I was building towards something that would last. I lost all of it inside 8 months, and I spent the time after that making sure I was never again in a position to lose something that actually mattered. Catherine stood without moving. Driving was safe, he said, not because it was easy, because it didn't ask me to want anything. I could just show up, execute, go home. Nothing to lose because nothing was actually mine. He turned and looked at her. And then tonight, I walked into that house with you, and I said things at that table that were true, and I stood in that hallway with Nathan and got asked a question I didn't have the answer to. And now I'm standing here in the rain and I need to say something honestly. Say it, Catherine said. Her voice was steady, only just. I don't want to be a shield, he said. For anyone. I've spent the past 1.5 years making myself small enough that I wouldn't matter when things went wrong. Tonight blew that up completely, and I can't decide yet if that's a good thing or the opposite. He looked at her directly. What I know is that I can't go back to driving you to work on Monday and treating this evening like it was a professional arrangement. Catherine looked at him for a long moment in the rain and the fluorescent light. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. She crossed her arms against the cold. Practical. A person who was going to stand in the rain until the conversation finished. I tore up that arrangement tonight, she said, and I have no idea what Monday looks like, or what my mother is going to say when she calls tomorrow morning, or how the board is going to respond when this gets out. I have no plan. I have not once in my adult life had no plan. Something moved through her face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite the opposite. It's terrifying, she said, and it's also the first time in 3 years that I feel like I'm standing in my own life. The rain came down around them, unhurried. Marcus raised his hand and very carefully, very lightly, tucked a strand of wet hair back from her face. The kind of gesture that has no professional explanation. No version of itself that belongs to the relationship they had maintained for 11 months. She looked up at him. The kiss was not dramatic. It was not the kind that gets scored with swelling music. It was the kind that happens when two people have run out of reasons not to, and the running out feels less like surrender than like finally telling the truth. Brief, certain. Without any of the theater the evening had required of either of them. When they separated, Catherine looked at him with something open in her expression that he hadn't seen before. Something that hadn't been armored, so she said, "What do we do now?" "I think," Marcus said, "we get back in the car, and then we figure out the rest." They got back in the car. Catherine sat in the front. He submitted his resignation the following Thursday. Not in anger, not in the flush of Saturday's emotion. After 5 days of sitting with it seriously, weighing what he was walking away from against what he had been, for the past year, successfully not walking toward. The chauffeur position had been a good job. It had given him exactly what he needed when he needed it. Stability, structure, the space to stop bleeding out from Meridian's collapse. But Saturday evening had made something visible that he had been carefully not looking at. He was still a structural engineer. He had been one for 12 years before the layoffs. He still understood how loads were distributed, how systems either held or failed based on decisions made long before the stress was applied. That knowledge had not gone anywhere. He had simply stopped applying it. He found a space in the Central East Side Industrial District, a former machine shop on Southeast Morrison, wide enough for equipment and inexpensive enough for what he could assemble. He called 2 people from Meridian's structural team he had stayed in distant contact with. He started quietly, without ceremony, because starting quietly and without ceremony was the only way anything real ever actually started. Catherine called the following Wednesday. They talked for 45 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the fund or his new lease or the dinner. She told him her mother had called Sunday morning as expected, and the conversation had been long and difficult, and had not resolved anything in either direction. He told her about the Morrison Street space, the ceiling height, the specific load distribution problem he was working through with the main floor. She listened, the way she listened in the car during late nights, fully, without interrupting, in a way that made the thing being described feel like it mattered. They began seeing each other the way people see each other when neither of them has a script for it. Irregularly, practically, without the architecture of romance that requires maintenance to sustain. She came to the workshop one evening, with food from a Thai place on Belmont, and sat on a metal stool, and watched him work for nearly 2 hours, asking questions when she had them, and not asking when she didn't. He walked with her in the Pearl District on a Sunday afternoon, unhurried, unnoticed. The press found out eventually, 4 months later. The story was approximately as uncharitable as Marcus had anticipated, and approximately as brief as Catherine had predicted. Several weeks of attention, pointed questions from 2 board members, and then the next thing happened in the news cycle, and the story became yesterday's version of itself. They got through it. Not without cost, but through it. Meanwhile, what was happening to Nathan Prescott? The Portland arrangement, once Catherine had publicly torn it apart, had collapsed the negotiation it was designed to underpin. The consolidation deal, which had relied on both family lines committing to the partnership, fell apart inside 6 weeks. Ashton Capital's board, who had been quietly told by Catherine's general counsel that the arrangement had never been properly disclosed to the independent directors, opened a governance review. The findings were specific, and they were not good for Richard Ashton's management of the fund's private dealings. Richard stepped back from his active board role in February. Nathan Prescott's position was more complicated. The arrangement had been his family's initiative as much as the Ashtons', and when it unwound publicly, the business press covered it in the particular way that most press covers things that were supposed to be private and weren't. Several partnership discussions Nathan had been conducting in the Pacific Northwest stalled. People in rooms he was used to walking into began asking questions before the meeting started. He was not finished. Men like Nathan Prescott are rarely finished. But the year that followed was the first year in his adult life in which he had to account for a decision that had not worked. At an industry dinner in Seattle in March, he ran into Catherine's general counsel, a woman named Louise Park, who had known Catherine for nearly a decade. Nathan asked Louise how Catherine was doing, and Louise told him she seemed well, and Nathan nodded and said, quietly, to Louise and not to the room, "I should have handled that differently. I knew it the night it happened. I just didn't know what differently looked like." Louise told Catherine what he'd said. Catherine held that for a long time without knowing what to do with it. That was the most honest thing Nathan had said to anyone about any of it, and it came only after the loss had already been total. The acknowledgement, when it finally arrived, was small and private and came too late to change anything. That is often how it goes. Eleanor Ashton came to the Morrison Street workshop on a Thursday afternoon in early March without calling ahead. Marcus was working on a detail drawing when he heard the door and assumed it was the steel delivery he'd been waiting on. When he looked up and saw Catherine's mother standing in the entrance of a former machine shop in the industrial district, wearing a coat that probably cost more than 2 months of his old salary, he set the drawing down and wiped his hands and waited. Eleanor looked around the space with the careful attention of a person taking something seriously that she had not expected to take seriously. The organized equipment, the drawings pinned to the wall, the quality of the light, which was good, because Marcus had replaced the overhead fixtures in his 3rd week. The particular order of a workspace belonging to someone who thinks precisely. Then she looked at Marcus. She walked across the floor and stopped a few feet away. He understood that he was looking at a woman who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where she held the structural advantage, and who was now figuring out how to stand in a room where she did not. "I'm not here to apologize for what I thought when I saw you at dinner," she said. Her voice was steady. Without warmth, but also without performance. "I thought what I thought. Pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest." "Okay," Marcus said. "I came because my daughter calls me differently now," Eleanor said. She said it the way someone says the thing they've been working toward, directly, having decided that an indirection is no longer a tool available to them. Not more often, differently, like she's talking to me instead of managing me. Marcus held her gaze. "I don't know what to do with you," Eleanor said, not hostile. Honest in the way that only becomes available when the more comfortable version has run out. I don't know how to fit you into the picture I'd built. I understand that's my problem and not yours. She looked at him steadily, but I wanted to see the face of the person who made that possible. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "She made that possible. I just stopped being one more person who needed her to be something specific." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. That, she said, may be the most valuable thing anyone has offered her in years. She left without anything being resolved. No reconciliation, no declared turning point, but she had come. She had said the true thing instead of the managed thing. For a woman who had spent decades in the managed version, Marcus understood that this was not nothing. It was the beginning of something that would take longer than an afternoon to become what it was going to be. 1 year after the Morrison Street workshop opened its doors, the building on Northeast Multnomah had a new structural reinforcement system. Marcus's firm had won the contract 9 months in, a mid-sized commercial renovation on a building that had been quietly failing for years. He had gone over the load calculations 3 separate times. He knew they were right. He had always known when his calculations were right. Catherine was already on the roof when he arrived, not dressed for anything in particular. Jeans, a coat, her hair loose in the wind coming off the river. She was looking out at the Portland skyline the way she used to look at it through the car window, but differently now. Less searching. More like someone who knows roughly where they are and is simply taking in the view from the new position. Marcus came to stand beside her. She handed him a small box without preamble. Inside was a key, the key to the company car he had driven for 11 months. The key Catherine had quietly kept when the fleet was updated. The same key she had turned over once in her fingers. On the night they walked into the estate together, setting it back down on the console with that small, deliberate care that he had noticed and said nothing about. Attached to the key was a small silver charm. He turned it over. Engraved on the back in clean, small letters, "Every road from here we ride up front." He held it for a moment. Then he closed his hand around it. The city below was doing what Portland does in early evening, going amber and green and alive with the particular energy of a place that does not apologize for its rain or its history or the complicated truth of what it's still becoming. Somewhere below them, traffic moved along Burnside. Somewhere below them, the structural system his firm had designed was doing exactly what it had been built to do. Holding the weight of the building quietly and without any fanfare, the way good structures always do. Catherine leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. They had already said the hard things. In a car on a cold Wednesday, in a hallway at a dinner that went sideways in the best possible way. In a gas station parking lot on the edge of the city, with rain coming down and nothing yet resolved. This was what came after the hard things. This was the part that didn't require a speech. He looked at his phone for a moment. A contact he hadn't called in over 2 years, a former colleague from Meridian who had moved to Denver after the company closed. He looked at the name for a moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket. The most complete kind of happiness doesn't arrive as a reward for getting everything right. It arrives as the recognition, quiet and specific, that the person standing beside you has seen the version of you that wasn't performing, wasn't midging, wasn't trying to be what the room required, and they chose to stay. What Marcus and Catherine found was not a fairy tale. It was something more durable than that. A choice made repeatedly by 2 people who understood that the distance between them was real and chose to cross it anyway. Not because crossing it was simple. Because the alternative, which was staying on the correct side of every line that had been drawn for them by people who had not asked their permission, had stopped being a life either of them recognized as their own. Status is real. The weight of other people's expectations is real. The fear of being seen clearly and found insufficient is one of the most universal things a person can feel. But none of those things are the final word on what you're allowed to want or who you're allowed to become. The only architecture that lasts is the one built on what is actually true about who you are, what you value, and who you choose to stand beside when the room stops watching. Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones who see us most clearly. Sometimes the life everyone told you was beneath you turns out to be the only one that was ever real. Sometimes the person standing quietly at the edge of the room, saying very little, watching everything, turns out to be the one who understood the whole situation from the beginning. Marcus Webb never announced who he was. He never needed to. The people who were paying attention had figured it out already. Dignity isn't given, it is recognized. And the people who refuse to see it in others are the ones who ultimately lose it themselves. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.